The jungle was alive with noise, cicadas, gunfire, and the guttural roar of men charging through the smoke. It was Saipan, 1944, and waves of Japanese infantry advanced with terrifying resolve, bayonets gleaming, voices rising in a single suicidal cry. For years, these banzai charges had shattered enemy lines and haunted Allied soldiers. But this time, they met something they had never faced before, a new American weapon that didn't fire bullets. It erased entire charges in seconds. As U.S. Marines dug in along the ridges of Saipan, they carried something fresh from the laboratories of the Pacific Theater, the M2 flamethrower. Heavy, primitive, and unpredictable, yet devastating. When Japanese troops broke cover, screaming across open ground, Marines unleashed jets of fire that reached 30 yards, coating everything in flame. Trees ignited. The night turned orange. The air reeked of burning oil and cordite. The old rules of war, courage, honor, blade-to-blade combat vanished under the roar of liquid fire. For the first time, fear shifted sides. The legendary Japanese banzai spirit met a weapon that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be stopped, and didn't miss. The jungle itself became an ally to the Americans, and a grave for those who charged it. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand what happened at Saipan, you have to go back to the brutal Pacific Island campaigns that preceded it. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu. Each battle revealed the same terrifying pattern. Japanese soldiers who would rather die than surrender, who charged with grenades strapped to their chests, who turned every cave and bunker into a tomb. The banzai charge wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Rooted in Bushido, the ancient warrior code, it promised that death in battle brought honor, while surrender brought eternal shame. Japanese officers told their men that Americans tortured prisoners, that capture meant disgrace worse than death. And so they charged, again and again, thousands at a time. American forces had weapons, yes, rifles, machine guns, artillery, but nothing prepared young Marines for the psychological shock of watching hundreds of screaming men run directly into gunfire, faces twisted with rage and resolve, refusing to stop even as their comrades fell around them. Some Marines broke, others froze. The banzai charge was as much a weapon of terror as it was a military maneuver. By 1944, U.S. command realized something had to change. Conventional weapons could kill the charging soldiers, but they couldn't stop the charge itself.
The solution came from an unlikely place: chemical engineers and weapons designers working in laboratories far from the front lines. They were developing something ancient yet revolutionary: portable fire. Flamethrowers weren't new. The Germans had used them in World War I, crude devices that shot burning liquid across trenches. But they were unreliable, dangerous to their operators, and had limited range. The U.S. military saw potential in the concept, but needed something better, something a single Marine could carry into combat and use effectively in the dense jungles of the Pacific. The result was the M2 flamethrower, officially designated the M2-2. It consisted of three main components: two cylindrical fuel tanks strapped to the operator's back, a nitrogen pressure tank, and a handheld nozzle with an ignition system. The fuel was a mixture of gasoline thickened with napalm, a newly developed compound that made the fire stick to whatever it touched and burn longer, hotter, and with horrifying persistence. The M2 weighed 70 pounds when fully loaded. It could shoot a stream of fire up to 30 yards for approximately 7 seconds of continuous use. 7 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in combat, 7 seconds of liquid fire was an eternity. Training Marines to use the M2 was a delicate process. The weapon was as dangerous to the operator as it was to the enemy.
One stray bullet into the fuel tanks could turn a Marine into a human torch. The weight threw off balance. The visible flame jet gave away positions. And psychologically, well, burning people alive was different from shooting them. It required a different kind of resolve. But the Pacific theater demanded it. Japanese defenders dug into caves, bunkers, and fortified positions that artillery couldn't reach. They hid in dense vegetation where rifles were ineffective. Traditional assaults cost hundreds of American lives for every yard gained. The brass needed a weapon that could clear caves without sending men inside, something that could penetrate vegetation, something that could break the Japanese will to fight. By mid-1944, flamethrower units were integrated into Marine battalions across the Pacific. They trained in specialized camps, learning to move with the cumbersome equipment, to aim the arcing stream of fire, to coordinate with riflemen who would protect them from snipers. The operators knew they were targets. Japanese soldiers learned quickly to shoot the men with the tanks on their backs. But what they didn't know yet was how effective they would become. Saipan was strategically vital. This 15-mile-long island in the Mariana Islands chain sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo, within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. If the Americans took Saipan, they could launch B-29 Superfortress bombers directly against Japan's industrial heartland. The Japanese High Command knew this. They fortified Saipan with 31,000 troops, artillery positions, and defensive networks carved into limestone cliffs. The American invasion began on June 15, 1944. 8,000 Marines landed on the beaches in the first wave, immediately met by intense artillery and machine gun fire. But they pushed inland, yard by bloody yard, taking casualties but advancing. The Japanese commanders, however, had a plan, one that had worked before. They would wait until nightfall. Then they would launch the largest banzai charge in Pacific War history. Thousands of soldiers, fueled by sake and patriotic fervor, would overwhelm the American positions through sheer numbers and ferocity. Officers distributed grenades, sharpened bayonets, and gave final speeches about dying with honor for the emperor. The Marines dug in as darkness fell, knowing what was coming. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the aftermath of banzai charges on other islands. But this time, scattered among the rifle companies were men carrying M2 flamethrowers. And this time, the jungle was about to burn. The charge began just after midnight on July 7, 1944. It started as a distant sound, voices rising in unison, a rhythmic chant that grew louder. Then came the rustling of hundreds of men moving through the jungle. Then the screams, "Banzai! Banzai!" The word itself meant 10,000 years, a wish for the emperor's eternal reign, but in battle it became a death cry. Flares shot into the sky, turning night into stuttering daylight. What the Marines saw froze their blood. A human wave emerging from the tree line, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging at full sprint, bayonets fixed. Some carrying only swords or bamboo spears, others clutching grenades. Officers led from the front, waving sabers above their heads. Behind them came the wounded from earlier battles, some hobbling on crutches, determined to die in this final assault. Machine guns opened fire immediately. Tracers crisscrossed the darkness. Artillery shells exploded among the charging ranks. Men fell by the dozens, but the charge didn't slow. This was the nightmare that haunted every Marine. Overwhelming numbers, suicidal courage, and the horror of hand-to-hand combat that would come if the line broke. And then, from 3 different positions along the American line, jets of orange fire shot into the darkness. The first flamethrower operator was a 19-year-old from Ohio named Private James Harding. He'd trained for 6 weeks on the weapon, but had never used it in combat. Now, watching the banzai charge materialize from the smoke, his hands shook as he gripped the nozzle.
His spotter, crouched beside him, shouted, "Now! Hit them now!" Harding squeezed the trigger. Pressurized nitrogen forced the napalm mixture through the nozzle where an ignition system set it ablaze. A stream of liquid fire erupted from his position, arcing 30 yards into the charging mass of soldiers. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The napalm didn't just burn, it stuck. It coated uniforms, skin, vegetation. Soldiers caught in the stream became living torches, their screams cutting through the battle noise. Others tried to help, to beat out the flames, only to catch fire themselves. The dense jungle vegetation ignited, creating walls of flame that cut off avenues of approach. The smell, burning fuel mixed with burning flesh, spread across the battlefield. But the charge didn't stop. Japanese soldiers ran around the flames, through the flames, over the bodies of burning comrades. They kept coming, bayonets forward, voices still screaming that single word. Harding's 7 seconds of fuel ran out. He dropped the nozzle and grabbed his rifle. Across the line, other flamethrower operators opened fire. Each burst created a new pocket of hell. The M2's range meant they could engage the charging soldiers before they closed to bayonet distance, the crucial gap where banzai charges became deadliest. Fire filled that gap with a wall nothing could cross. But the weapon had limitations. 70 pounds of equipment made operators slow, clumsy targets. Japanese soldiers learned within minutes to focus fire on the men with tanks on their backs. Bullets pinged off the metal cylinders. Some ricocheted, others penetrated. When a fuel tank was breached, the results were instantaneous and horrific. The operator and everyone nearby became an explosion of fire. Marine riflemen formed protective screens around the flamethrower teams. It became a brutal ballet. Riflemen engaging distant targets while flamethrower operators dealt with close-range threats. Coordination was everything. Break the pattern and the entire position collapsed. The banzai charge reached the American line in several places. Japanese soldiers leaped into foxholes, swinging swords and bayonets. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. Brutal, primal combat decided by inches and seconds. But wherever flamethrowers operated, the line held. The fire created barriers, broke up formations, and, most importantly, shattered the psychological momentum that made banzai charges effective. Private Harding survived the night, but 2 other flamethrower operators in his company didn't. One took a rifle round through his fuel tank and immolated instantly. Another was overrun when Japanese soldiers flanked his position through a gap in the line. His body was found at dawn, still clutching the empty flamethrower nozzle, surrounded by enemy dead. The larger banzai charge continued for nearly 2 hours. Wave after wave crashed against the Marine positions. Some estimates put the attacking force at over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, the largest mass suicide attack of the Pacific War. By the time it ended, American forces had suffered over 400 casualties. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. More than 2,500 dead, their bodies carpeting the ground in front of the Marine lines. The flamethrowers hadn't single-handedly stopped the charge. Artillery, machine guns, and rifle fire did most of the killing. But they'd done something more important. They'd broken the mystique. For years, banzai charges had worked because they were psychologically overwhelming, because they exploited the human instinct to flee from charging enemies. Fire flipped that equation. It created a barrier more terrifying than the charge itself. After Saipan, Japanese commanders began to question the banzai charge as a viable tactic. The Americans, meanwhile, began to rely on flamethrowers for every island assault. The success at Saipan led to rapid deployment of flamethrowers across the Pacific Theater. By August 1944, every Marine division had dedicated flamethrower platoons. The weapon proved invaluable for clearing the elaborate cave systems and bunker networks that characterized Japanese defenses on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
At Iwo Jima in February 1945, flamethrower operators became the most crucial soldiers on the battlefield. Mount Suribachi and the island's volcanic landscape were honeycombed with interconnected tunnels and fortified positions. Artillery couldn't reach them, grenades were ineffective. But flamethrowers could spray fire deep into cave openings, consuming the oxygen inside and forcing defenders out, or killing them where they hid. The tactic was brutal but effective. Flamethrower teams would approach a cave entrance under covering fire, position themselves at an angle to avoid direct fire from inside, then unleash sustained bursts of flame. The fire didn't just burn, it created a vacuum effect, sucking oxygen out of connected chambers. Soldiers deep inside complexes died from asphyxiation before the flames ever reached them. But the human cost on both sides was staggering. Flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima had a life expectancy measured in minutes during assaults. Japanese defenders, meanwhile, faced a choice between burning alive or emerging into machine gun fire. Neither side could claim moral high ground. The true revelation came in the battle's aftermath, when Marine commanders analyzed the effectiveness of different weapon systems. The data was startling. In cave-clearing operations, flamethrowers achieved objective completion rates over 80%, with significantly lower friendly casualties than conventional assault methods. One flamethrower team could neutralize a fortified position that would otherwise require hours of fighting and dozens of casualties. But the weapon's impact went beyond statistics. It fundamentally changed Japanese defensive doctrine. After Saipan, banzai charges became rare. Japanese commanders realized that massed frontal assaults against an enemy equipped with flamethrowers was tantamount to sending men into a furnace. Instead, they shifted to defensive warfare, making the Americans pay for every inch with mines, ambushes, and fortified positions. This shift, ironically, made the Pacific War even bloodier. Rather than decisive banzai charges that could be repelled, Americans now faced grinding attrition warfare. The flamethrower evolved from a weapon against mass attacks into a tool for methodical, systematic destruction of defensive networks. Every cave, every bunker, every fortified house in Okinawa's towns all faced the same fate: a stream of fire that left nothing alive inside. The weapon that stopped the charges became the weapon that burned islands clean. Fire had become the signature of American warfare in the Pacific. The psychological impact on both sides cannot be overstated. For Japanese soldiers, the flamethrower represented something beyond conventional warfare. It was a weapon that denied them even the dignity of death in combat. Burning alive, unable to fight back, trapped in confined spaces, this was not the honorable death Bushido promised. Captured documents revealed that Japanese soldiers feared flamethrowers more than any other American weapon, including artillery and tanks. For American Marines, operating the M2 created its own moral burden. Many flamethrower operators struggled with what they were ordered to do. Burning people alive, hearing their screams, smelling the results, left psychological scars that rifles and grenades didn't. Post-war interviews revealed that flamethrower veterans suffered disproportionately high rates of combat trauma and guilt. Yet commanders justified it through the lens of necessity. Each cave cleared with fire meant fewer Marines sent inside to die. Each banzai charge broken by flame meant dozens of American lives saved. The utilitarian calculus was cold but clear. Burning the enemy was more efficient than bleeding your own men to death in frontal assaults. By war's end, the M2 had become synonymous with Pacific combat. Photographs of Marines silhouetted against streams of fire became iconic images. Fire had become strategy. Fire had become victory. The final bitter irony came during the planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of mainland Japan scheduled for November 1945. American planners anticipated using flamethrowers on an unprecedented scale. Not just portable M2 units, but tank-mounted versions, aircraft-delivered napalm, and specialized flamethrower battalions.
The expectation was that every Japanese city, town, and village would become a fortress requiring systematic burning to clear. Casualty estimates for downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American deaths, with Japanese civilian casualties in the tens of millions. The flamethrower, originally developed to stop banzai charges on isolated islands, would have become the primary weapon for urban warfare across an entire nation. The same fire that stopped the charge at Saipan would have swept through Tokyo's wooden neighborhoods, Osaka's industrial districts, Kyoto's ancient temples. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered before American flamethrower teams ever set foot on the home islands. But the bombs themselves were, in a sense, the ultimate evolution of what the M2 represented. Fire as absolute weapon. Destruction so complete that resistance becomes meaningless. The weapon that changed warfare in the Pacific had, unknowingly, foreshadowed the weapons that would end it. When the war ended, the M2 flamethrower was quietly retired from frontline service. The weapon had served its purpose, but post-war America wasn't eager to celebrate a device that burned people alive. While rifles, tanks, and aircraft became museum pieces, flamethrowers were stored away, their contributions downplayed in official histories. The men who operated them rarely spoke about their experiences. The physical scars of flamethrower warfare remained visible for decades. On islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the rock faces still showed black scorch marks where caves had been cleared with fire. The vegetation patterns revealed where jungle had been burned away. And in the memories of survivors, both American and Japanese, the smell of napalm lingered long after the flames died. Japanese veterans interviewed decades later still described the flamethrower with a mixture of fear and respect. It was, they said, the weapon that made them understand the war was lost. When fire became a tactic, when the jungle itself could be weaponized, traditional warrior codes meant nothing. Courage couldn't defeat chemistry. Honor couldn't stop combustion. For American veterans, the legacy was more complicated. They'd done what was necessary to win, but necessary didn't mean easy to remember or accept. The weapon that saved their lives had cost them pieces of their souls. Today, the M2 flamethrower exists mostly in museums and military history texts, but its impact on warfare was profound and lasting. It proved that psychological weapons could be as decisive as firepower, that breaking an enemy's will mattered as much as breaking their lines. It demonstrated that in total war, traditional concepts of honor and combat became luxuries neither side could afford. The banzai charges that terrified Marines in 1942 and 1943 were effectively extinct by 1945, replaced by defensive warfare that made the Pacific campaign even bloodier but more predictable. The flamethrower didn't just stop charges, it changed how wars were fought in the 20th century. From Vietnam's napalm strikes to modern thermobaric weapons, the principle remained the same. Fire dominates space in ways bullets cannot. But perhaps the deepest legacy is moral. The M2 flamethrower forced both sides to confront an uncomfortable truth. In modern warfare, there are no clean weapons, no honorable methods, only victory and defeat, survival and death. The jungle may have stopped burning decades ago, but the questions it raised about the cost of war still burn bright. If this story moved you, share it so more people can discover the truths time almost erased. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the silence that followed, history took a deep breath and changed forever.